Hi, I'm Catherine Engelhardt-Kronk, and once again today we're visiting with Gary Gotze, and we're talking about transforming nonprofits for the 21st century. Glad you're here, Gary.
Glad to be back. Looking forward to the conversation.
I am going to ask you about a topic that I hear about often from the nonprofits that I work with, and that is this whole topic of managing volunteers. That volunteers, most nonprofits know that volunteers are a very important resource because they may not have the money to hire all the staff they need.
Right.
But I consistently see or hear about nonprofits who have problems successfully utilizing that resource, from recruitment to support, the whole 9 yards. So.
Right.
I know you've had lots of experience in doing that, and I'd like to ask you to talk a bit about how to manage volunteers and give us tips on how a nonprofit can go about changing their strategy with volunteers.
Beautiful. Volunteers are the lifeblood of a nonprofit. It's a fact. And some people believe that deeply and act accordingly. Some people don't believe that and act accordingly. In other words, they view them as a necessary evil. And when they do that, it tends to cause lots of issues that show up on down the road. Let's talk first, though, about the need and the value of having volunteers, and really starting at the beginning. How do we get them in the door? How do we keep them? How do we engage them?
Well, part of them is that story that you talked about in our last session. The staff and the executive directors and the volunteer recruiter have got to have the story. They have to be able to make a compelling reason to be there.
The biggest fatal flaw with using a volunteer is not having anything for the volunteer to do. It is recruiting people either because of their name or their status in the community. And while I admit that some of that may be necessary in some situations, what we're generally talking about here is recruiting volunteers to help be an extension of your agency, to help you get your mission and your work done in the community. So the first thing is to clearly articulate and come up with a plan of what you want the volunteer to do. I believe very strongly that executives should recruit people face to face. Executives recruiting their board members should do that face to face. Catherine, I can tell you hundreds of volunteer organizations across this country either do it by letter or they do it by phone. I don't believe that's good enough, and here's why. I think that you got to be able to sit in front of someone if you're asking them to serve your organization.
Sure.
And I'm not talking about 1,000 volunteers for a special event. I'm talking about your core volunteers for the agency. You got to be able to articulate what are your expectations, what do you need them to do, what kind of financial commitment might be required to be a volunteer, specifically what's their job description, and then have a chance to dialogue and interact with them to see if you really want them and they want you. You can't do that on the telephone.
Right.
You can't do that in a letter. And then most importantly is to ask the question, will you do this for this organization, number one, and will you do it for me as the executive of the organization, building some kind of automatic commitment to both the organization and the executive. Far, far too often, I've seen it recently, where people try to recruit volunteers in an impersonal way. And it doesn't allow you to get started on the right foot, in my estimation, by doing that.
That's interesting.
One of the most important things that I take with me when I recruit volunteers is a volunteer checklist. It looks elementary. It's worked for 32 years. You can share with the volunteer in a really elementary kind of way. Here are the things you can expect from me, and here's what I expect from you. And then you can talk about those things.
That's a great idea.
Do you understand that we ask you to do these things? And then it creates a dialogue. And ultimately, it creates a chance for them to either accept or not accept, or to think about it further. So having that formality initially is extremely important in getting volunteer leaders into the organization. That's step one.
Do you have any thoughts about numbers of volunteers taking aside the huge events where you're
Yeah.
doing a gala or you're doing some big fundraiser, but core volunteers, is there some sort of magic metric that says if I'm an organization that has 3 employees, how many volunteers can I handle? If I'm an organization with 30 employees, how many core volunteers should I be recruiting?
No magic metrics, and here's why. It depends on your scope and your mission, what
Okay.
you're trying to get done in the organization. Some organizations are built to fundraise, and if you're building a fundraising organization, you're probably going to want to build a much bigger cadre of volunteers because of the nature of what you're trying to get done. So you'll need a broader reach in the community, a broader appeal in the community, and therefore you might need more bodies. If you're an organization that may be a smaller organization that perhaps is a counseling organization who isn't so focused on raising money as much as they are on quality programming and development of programs to meet the needs, you're probably going to lean toward a smaller board. I do know that the trends are showing around the nation that nonprofits are leaning towards smaller boards now. Here's why. The world's changing so fast. The environment's changing so fast. The typical nonprofit of 1960, 70, and 80 took 67 years to make decisions. I'm exaggerating.
Not much.
It took them forever to make a decision. You know why? Because they had 50, 60, 80 member boards of directors. You couldn't possibly get in a room at a board meeting
Get
and
anything
make a
done.
decision with 80 people in a room.
No.
Impossible. So you've seen a skewing to a smaller group of people, let's say between some as small as 6 up to 20 or so. People who are intimately engaged in the organization, who know the business, who know their role, which is really, really important.
That's really important.
Who
in my
know what their
experience.
role is as a policymaker, not to come in and run the organization, not to come in and tell the executive what to do, not to come in and tell the staff what to do. Boy, we should talk about that,
Yes.
because that's where the big rub usually happens between volunteers, boards, and nonprofits, is the distinguishing line about what is the role of the board member versus the staff member.
Okay, so let's talk about that. If you were to say 3 ways that an executive director could avoid a situation occurring like that, and it happens all the time. It's happened to me.
It's happened to me.
Where a volunteer on a board comes in and maybe talks to your staff about you and doesn't go through you,
Yeah.
or simply has wonderful ideas because they're so excited, but they look at you as somebody who's supposed to carry those out in the organization, not as you're the leader and they're providing governance and support. What are the 3 things?
3 things. Set the expectations up front, in person, very clearly. Here's my job. Here's your job. Here's what you can expect of me, and this is what I expect of you.
Back to the
Number 1.
checklist.
Doesn't
Okay.
always work. If that doesn't work, over communicate. I'm talking about do not let it fester to the point where it's uncontrollable. So if you start to see signs of a board chair who is overbearing, who's showing up at the office, who's telling you what to do, you got to get on it at that point. Not in a mean or unprofessional way, but you've got to say, look, I'm observing this. I'm observing you doing the following things. That's not the role of the board chair. And try to be clear about that. That doesn't always work. The third thing to do is to bring it all to a head and perhaps have some kind of mediation if you want to save the relationship. That happened to me. It happened to me probably 20 years into my career. I've been very fortunate. And I made it to a point where it was, I thought, going to be myself or the board chair. I was ready to walk away from the job. It was that miserable. And we ultimately got to step 2 of that process, where I confronted her and said, I can't work another day like this. And all along I'd been sending her books. articles, the role of the board chair, the role of the board chair. She didn't get it. Ultimately, we were able to work that out, and the last 6 months of that year was probably one of the more productive 6 months. I think a lot of that can be avoided by having the quality conversation up front, not the one that beats around the bush or halfway gets at the topic,
Right.
but the one that really articulates, here's what you can expect from me, and here's what I expect from you.
I really like that, and I really like the checklist idea, because I think, and I've just been working with a nonprofit where it's often the case where they don't have a clear understanding of that, and they think it's a huge job to figure that out. So when you say, maybe we need to start by, clearly articulating what you do and what you need from the board, they think they're going into a 6-month planning session.
It's very simple. It's common sense stuff. And it can also be different for every organization. That's what I said initially. I mean, you might have an agency who needs to get this done in the following period of time. It may require a different kind of board member, but it wouldn't be hard to articulate, what do I expect you to do? You do it with your employees.
Sure, that's right.
You do it with them. Here's what my expectations are. Here's what I expect you to do on the job. Here's how I will communicate with you. Here's how you'll be measured on the job. By the way, that's an effective practice as well. It's real simple on SurveyMonkey.
Sure.
To come up with a board survey to find out if their experience as a board member is one which is satisfying them. That's real easy to do.
I think that's really important. Having been and am now a volunteer with several organizations, there are some where I feel like they know what they want from me, I can do it, I feel good about it, and there are some that I'm just floating along.
You don't know what you're doing. You don't get communication, you're not sure, you don't really know if you're being utilized. All of that can be simply rectified with a plan, a way to measure it once again, active engagement in talking to people. How about that? And I like over communication.
Right.
I like communicate. Even if someone says, don't be sending me a bunch of stuff, I send them a bunch of stuff.
Sure.
I just do, and that's always been
Good
my
advice.
practice.
There are some internet-based resources that I've found and sent to nonprofits that help with some very basic sort of board governance templates, definitions of what board members do versus what staff or executives do. And I'm going to ask that we include some of those sites at the end of this segment so that people can go, because they're a good place to start if you feel overwhelmed. It is a lot simpler, I think, than it seems when you're just sitting there thinking, how do I start? How do I manage this?
I do. I think you're right. And all of those, I've looked at some of those, and some of them are excellent. And there have been books written on the role of the CEO, the role of the board chair in nonprofits. And as a matter of fact, I don't have that title in my brain right now, but I read one recently. It was excellent. It was black and white. And I think what happens, Catherine, are executives get afraid.
I think that's right.
They get afraid of being willing to say, here's what I expect from you because you're a volunteer. Maybe I shouldn't be saying, maybe I shouldn't be telling you what I expect. Volunteers are human. Like you and me and you and I, they want to know what's expected of them. They want to know
so they
what
can succeed.
Yeah, so they can succeed. If you don't know what is being expected of you, how are you going to possibly feel good about your experience and even know if you did anything that was of value or not? And I think that could be really taken care of. By the way, I made it a practice for me. One of the first conversations 6 months before they become the board chair, because I always believed in multiple year recruitment. 6 months out was that conversation. Here's what I'm going to expect from you. Here's what you can expect from me. And really be able to understand if that was going to be something they would be willing to live with or they needed some help with to get there before we ever started our board year.
This was interesting. I appreciate it. I learned a lot. I hope our viewers learned a lot. And we will make sure that there are some resources at the end that are posted so folks can begin this process. Thanks,
Great.
Gary.
You're welcome.